pleased to welcome you all are present here at the auditorium, Beacon Hill, but also Beacon Street, but also the people who are joining us on Facebook Live. Today we are reflecting in this third session on the question of the colonial spiritualities of re-existence. We have been discussing in the last two panels about epistemology, coming from the movements, social movements in resistance. Then the question of rituals, performativity, trying to decolonize those categories. And then this morning, following Nelson Maldonado-Torres lectures about the coloniality related to liberation and theology and philosophy, we will be moving today to this last session, which is related to the colonial spirituality. So welcome the panelists and then the moderator, Valentina and Nilo. Please welcome. Thank you.
Thank you, Carlos. Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to this fourth and last Conversatorio of our fall semester colloquium. And I want to express first my gratitude for the invitation to this space of sharing, thinking together. Today our speakers will be sharing some reflections on decolonial spiritualities of re-existence. I will first present them, each of them. Then we'll have 25 minutes to share their insights and their reflections. After your presentations, Dr. Nelson Maldonado-Torres will be offering a response. And in a third moment, we will have some minutes for the assistants for their questions and reflections. So I'll start with Dr. Valiente. He earned his doctorate in systematic theology at the University of Notre Dame. He then joined the faculty at the Boston College School of Theology and Ministry, where he is currently Associate Professor of Systematic Theology. His main areas of scholarly interest include political and liberation theology and theologies of social reconciliation. Dr. Rufus Burnett is an Assistant Professor of Systematic Theology at Fordham University in Bronx, New York. His research focuses on the soulic, spatial, and embodied realities of the Christian imagination. Burnett's constructive theological approach to systematics looks to expose the theological insight of people groups that respond to domination through the creative use of cultural production. His latest text, Decolonizing Revelation, a spatial reading of the blues, engaged the cultural production of the blues as an option for delinking the Christian imagination of Revelation from oppressive foreclosures within nationalism, US Christianities, race, class, sexuality, and ethnocentrism. And then Soledad Del Villar, she's a PhD candidate in theology here at the Theology Department at Boston College. She received her Master of Theological Studies from the School of Theology and Ministry and her Master's in Contemporary History of Chile at Universidad Resultado in Chile. She's today working on her dissertation about the abuse crisis in the Chilean Catholic Church. So yeah, welcome, and we'll start with.
Thank you, everybody, for being here. Thank you, Carlos, for the invitation. This couple of days have been fantastic. So there's a lot to learn, and let's hope we can contribute a little bit to this process. So what is my task? My task is to compare the liberation theology spirituality, one articulated by John Sobrino, with the spiritualities that emerge from lived faith of contemporary social movements, those with a decolonial inspiration. Why do I want to? I want to do that because I'm really concerned about building bridges between liberation theology and decolonial thought. I think that there is a lot of continuity between the two of them. So the purpose, as you can see there, is to suggest that these two spiritualities stand largely in continuity, and to suggest that the liberation spirituality, and this is important, in a theological modality, and we're going to go back to that word, can empower survivors to resist and re-exist in a religious plural context. So before I begin to talk about that, I want to give you a little background on liberation spirituality and why does it emerge? It emerged largely as in response to the neo-scholastic spiritualities. Okay? So, for example, Gustavo Gutierrez, and I think it's in the book Drink from Your Own Wells, from Our Own Wells, he makes the point that there are three problems with these spiritualities. These are the pre-Second Vatican Council spiritualities. One it tends to be elitist. Why? Because it has been intended only for very small groups. If you were a priest, if you were a religious, lay people were not expected to have this spiritual. Okay, so that was problem. Then, even more serious is the issue of being an escapist spirituality. Why? Because it tended to divide the reality in two separate planes of existence. On the one hand, you have the sacred plane. On the other one, you have the profane. So the assumption is, if I want to get close to God, I have to do it. I have to go enter into a religious sphere. This is fuga mundi, okay? And the other one is, it tends to be very individualistic. While the development of the interior life is very important, when neo-scholastic spirituality overstressed that personal relationship with God, to the extent that the social and the political got completely really non-existent. Okay? So religion became, or Christianity, to be more specific, became something practical. Okay? Something that you do at home, something that you do on Sundays, but whatever you did between Sunday and Saturday, that's nothing to do with it. Okay? Now, liberation theology has some very important assumptions that I think are going to be relevant for us as we look at the development of the colonial spiritualities. The first thing is the idea that there is only one history. You have a story theology, and you're familiar with this. There are no two spheres. There is only one history where the human being encounters God. Yeah. So God transcends our reality, okay? But also God reveals God's self to us in the finite, in the materiality of the world. So this spirituality has a deeply sacramental view of the world that sees the divine present in creation, the spiritual present in the material, and the eternal present in the historical. Then the next step is that the unity of contemplation and action. In very general terms, if you, for example, ask a Dominican, they are going to tell you that, our relationship with God has two moments: the moment of contemplation and the moment of action, to work and to pray. And that is okay as long as we are very clearly that the moment of contemplation cannot be separated from the moment. That contemplation fits action and action fits contemplation. Yeah. So my engagement with the world, it's also an engagement with God. Now, I can still have that gratuitous moment when I contemplate. Why do I contemplate? Because I am passing in the presence of God, and I will see the gratuitous love of God. But these are really not two separate moments, but one in the Christian life. That's why theologians like John Sobrino and in the Jesuit tradition, the idea, you must have heard it before, the idea of contemplation in action became very important. And basically the idea of to become a contemplative in action is to be able to find God in all things, to be able to find God in the world. That's another important assumption in the in liberation spirituality. Then the third one has to do with the fact that every spirituality is contextual. Okay? We drink from our own wells, says Soledad Del Villar in the title of this book. But at the same time, my spirituality has to be a response to the reality in which I live. Okay? And that's why we can speak of the option for the poor also as a spiritual stance. Okay? Because it's the response of the people to a world of injustice, to a world of suffering. Okay? So there are two things there. Drinking from our own wells and the preferential options for the poor. Then the understanding of salvation, as you know, again, Gustavo Gutierrez, and the idea that salvation is not only salvation of the soul, but we're talking about the salvation of all of creation, the salvation of the full human being, the salvation of the body. Okay? So at the personal level, then at the social level, because our social arrangements, our social relations also have been damaged, and they need to be restored. Okay? In the same way, our economic systems, our culture, all that needs to be saved. And also salvation from sin, which is the spiritual salvation. And the last basic assumption is that spirituality in liberation theology is always communal. Okay? It's never individual, never the person. Oh. That's a general context. Now I'm going to begin to, I have to do some, stay a little open. If you look at the work of Sandra Schneider's or Bernard McGee, who have done a lot of work on spirituality, when they look at this, at the story of spirituality, they find different approaches because there are different definitions of spirituality. So they identify basically three of them. We are going to pick the one that is highlighted here. Okay, so one is a theological approach that stresses the distinctive Christian character of spirituality. Okay? Another one is a historical approach that enlists hermeneutical and critical methods to locate and consider the socio-historical context of spirituality. And the one that I think is most beneficial for our purpose, for a spirituality that is in line with decolonial thinking, and that is also embraced by liberation theology, is an anthropological approach. Let me read this because I think it's important. This approach recognizes spirituality as a human constant, and so focuses on the human person's existential capacity for self-transcendence through his or her engagement of the world, and envisions Christian spirituality as the actualization of that capacity. Okay? Now, so John Sobrino, the guy that I wanted to emphasize that I have chosen, follows this anthropological approach. His spirituality, or an aspect of his spirituality, follows this anthropological approach. Okay, so because of that, for Sobrino, spirituality touches all aspects of the human person. Spirituality is not this praxis or this or just praying the rosary. No. Spirituality is the manner in which the human being engages the world. Okay. More specifically, spirituality has to do with the dispositions or the spirit with which we engage the world. I'm getting closer to where I'm going. Okay? And these dispositions or spirits are very important because it tells you that not all spiritualities are the same. So really is going to say everybody has a spirituality, everybody has a disposition, everybody has a way of engaging the world. But there are some ways that open you up to the transcendence and open you up to creation and open you up to the order. And there are other dispositions, other spirits that close you up. So no all spiritualities are the same. Okay? Now, why did I choose Sobrino? And this is the tricky part to explain. John Sobrino really has, he develops his spirituality kind of in two steps. Really, this is the Christian spirituality, the one to the right. What do I mean by that? For liberation theologians, if you read Gustavo Gutierrez, Leonardo Boff, you read the classics. When we are talking about spirituality, we really are talking about following Jesus. That's, that's spirituality. That's Christian spirituality, to follow Jesus. And this following of Jesus has two dimensions, an enigmatological dimension and a Christological dimension. The Christological dimension are the incarnation, the mission, the cross, the resurrection. But we also have the spirit, okay, a pneumatological dimension. So a spirit of honesty with reality, a spirit of fidelity with reality, and the spirit of trust. While this spirituality is a spirituality for people who are Christians and has a Christian context, what he calls the theological spirituality, okay, is a spirituality that does not make a confession of faith on Jesus Christ. It's telling you the type of dispositions that one should embrace to be able to actualize one's fullness, to engage the world fully, completely. So I am going to make the point that theological spirituality is the one that is particularly convenient to us, okay? Especially in a pluralistic context. Now, before you ask me this question, Sobrino later on is going to tell you, what do you have dispositions? And he says, when I came up with dispositions, I drew them from the way in which Jesus engaged the world. So he doesn't use the word Jesus, but Jesus and the manner in which he engaged the world is behind his disposition. He's pulling around. Okay? Okay. Now, So I have talked a little bit about liberation theology, spirituality, and I'm going to go back to that. And then it comes the most difficult part to share with you, because this is the shaky part of my presentation. Okay? I'm concerned about speaking of the decolonial spirituality. However, given my incipient knowledge of decolonial thought and praxis, it would be impossible to systematize what could be defined as a colonial spirituality. Rather, I plan to draw from the spiritual insights shared by the contemporary communities of resistance, communities and social movements that already seem to have some degree of the decolonial inspiration. So here, to be able to do that, I'm thinking on the social movements that converged last summer in the workshop and festival entitled The Spirit Crossing the Peripheries in Guadalajara. Okay? This event was organized, among others, by our friend Carlos Mendoza, and in which also participated some of our colleagues present here today. You know, and it brought together different social movements, artistic communities, and academics, and I quote, to share their feelings, thoughts, and spiritualities. Now, there were, how many social movements were there, Carlos? There are 40 social movements. I cannot mention all of them, but I want to give you a taste of the type of social movement. So I'm just mentioning 5. La Brigada de Búsqueda de Personas Desaparecidas, del Movimiento Cosecha. That's a movement that is fighting for the permanent protection, you know, and dignity for undocumented immigrants. The Unión de Cooperativa Tosepan, that has, I think, 25,000 members already. Frente de los Pueblos en Defensa de la Tierra, Salvador Atenco. So you see the diversity. I mean, we're talking about 45 that come here. So, and also the Colectivo COLLOQUIUM, which is a community that works on issues of sexual diversity and gender identity. Well, another problem is, and this is where it gets a little funny, I was not able to attend the event in person for this presentation. So to be able to make these deductions that I'm making, I am relying on a number of documentaries that were recorded by the participants. You can see these documentaries, okay? So this is not, I am not doing research, okay? And I'm telling you outright, I am using this as an exercise to be able to talk about, compare the two spiritualities, okay? Now, nevertheless, as I was considering this presentation, and looking at those videos, I was encouraged by the methodology that was being used in the encounter. One of the organizers noted that this event, and I quote, places the members of social movements at the center of the conversation as holders and dispensers of wisdom, as experts on the human condition. That's the appropriate methodology. We've been talking about this. Or, and I think this is a friend of mine who said this, these movements are at the center of the conversation because they are the ones that are day in and day out confronting and resisting violence. They strive on a daily basis to continue to exist and re-exist. And then I would add, to become a new creation, even as they are surrounded by challenging and difficult conditions. The role of the theologians in these conversations was to listen. Largely the role that, many times Nestor has played with us. He's been listening, carefully paying attention and listening. So shifting the role of the academic. Now, there is not an explicit spirituality among these groups, but their participations and their celebrations suggest a strong pluralistic spirit among the participants, and also an openness to learn to listen from different traditions. Okay. What is common, I think, among all these groups is that they tend to have a deeply international incarnational spirituality. We were talking about that this morning. One that is concerned and takes responsibility for the well-being of the world. This is not a fuga mundi spirituality, okay? Consequently, the point that I am making is that the understanding of spirituality that would enable us to examine the convergence between the colonial spirituality of the social movements of resistance and liberation theology is not one that centers around the confession and the following of Jesus, but one that proceeds from the experience and stresses the incarnational emphasis of the Christian imagination from a theocentric perspective. Such approach recognizes spirituality as a human constant and focuses on the human person's existential capacity for self-acceptance. Now, and I'm going to try to be very fast because I only have 5 minutes. But here I want you to see that there is a correlation between what I would call the 3 moments, spiritual moments in the encounter. The encounter, when I was looking at the videos, there were 3 moments that they were very clearly defined. One was called to despertar, to awaken. Then there was another that was a healing and resilience. And then finally, there was a moment of hope. And I'm going to show you how there is certain correspondence with Sobrino's 3 dispositions. Okay? To awaken is to recognize that we live in a violent world, that we live in a world that discriminates. Awakening is the experience that calls you into action to work for justice, for others, and for yourself. For Sobrino, similarly, okay, we can only be honest with reality if we place our bodies in the middle of that thing. We cannot know from a distance. We have to be there. Yeah? It is, in a way, a call to conversion because it challenges us to see the world as it is, not as it is convenient to me, to see the world for what it is. So for Sobrino, this notion of honesty with reality is very similar to Metz and spirituality of open eyes. To look at the world as it is and here is key, and to be able to discern the distinction between where grace is present and where there is the deformation of sin. To read the signs of the times. Okay? And then Sobrino makes the next point. When we see the world as it is, what we encounter is a suffering. And the immediate reaction, very similar to a Skillet's negative contrast experience, the immediate reaction is one of compassion. That's the way the human being has been constituted. So that compassion is what informs, is the principle of the spirituality. Love, but not just love, that love that takes the modality before suffering. Okay? And that is what should inform the rest of our spirituality. The next, the second step is one of praxis, okay? Here, I'm going to be very honest with you. I'm just going to have to summarize and tell you the point that I want to make. I was really surprised. Not surprised, but I love the way that the decolonial movements take care of themselves. They take care of their community. They are really concerned about developing resilience, of healing memories. There is not much of that in Sobrino's development of that spirituality. Sobrino's emphasis is at work, is the mission. It is we are going to transform the world. And the problem then is that you get the sense that there is a little stoicism there. And you wonder, how do I nurture that spirit of the enemy? So here I found a place where I think Sobrino has something to learn. And the last moment is the moment of hope, okay? And I love that that's a direct quote, okay? To live in the hopeless that was to be again hidden in a closet, leaving oneself to be oppressed by everybody, even by oneself. And then there is that wonderful quote that who actually lent me the pictures to, and I want to thank you for that. In an interview, she says, she's talking about the resurrection, but I call it hope, and I think she is quoting Carlos Mendoza. She says, this hope can be understood as a whisper that is breaking into the time, in the here and now, opening a crack in the systems of oppression. Notice the sense of hope. It's a modest sense of hope, okay? And it's a hope that where the agency of our agency of the human being is very important. For Sobrino, here, he emphasizes that we need a spirit of trust so we can allow the grace of reality to guide us, okay? This grace infuses us with the necessary strength to confront the presence of sin in the world and provide us with an initial sense of direction to move history forward in the long search for its and our own fulfillment. So here, what Sobrino is telling us, and it's very similar to what the communities are telling us, is that we must learn to see grace in the world. That grace is, the world is not just sheer negativity, but there is a current of hope. And that current of hope carries us sometimes. Our community carries us. We need the other to be with us. Okay? So, these two spiritualities are deeply international and practical. They find their transcendence not by escaping from the world, but in history, in the praxis, in the order. They both seek to heal and respond to a world that suffers, to a world deformed by the effects of sin. Perhaps their emphases are a little different. Liberation spirituality stresses the urgent mission to transform the world, while the spirituality of the colonial movements also seek the transformation, the re-exist of the world. But its expectation to achieve a rapid transformation is modest. And they seem to scare the notion of utopia. Their stress seems to be on building communities of solidarity and resistance posed for the long struggle. These are inclusive communities that celebrate their own indigenous ways of thinking, but are deeply aware of their interconnectedness with the world. For them, community life, what is real today, seems to be as important as the promise for a new world. Thank you.
Thank you, Pedro. Dr. Burnett, welcome and thank you for your insights.
Okay. So part of what I wanted to do today is kind of already been presented to some degree in my comments earlier. So I hope, since I've talked already, that I'll be brief and just put some things into the conversation about spirituality, what I could see as a kind of contestation between perspectives on spirituality that kind of play out in what I've already introduced as the kind of conversation between the study of Black religion and Black theology. But since I'm a visitor in many ways to Latin American decolonial theory in particular, I wanted to do something autobiographical to start, because sometimes people always ask me afterwards, why decolonial theory for you? Why not just go with Black theology and just keep going? Why Latin American decolonial theory in particular? Well, that has to do with part of my formation, and I'd be remiss if I didn't mention some of that formation today, not because I think my formation is the best, but because we all get here through conversations with someone else. And that space was Xavier University in Louisiana, under the direction of the Sisters of the Blessed Sacrament and St. Catherine Drexel. And in that space, the first book in the 2 courses on theology that we were required to take was Gustavo Gutierrez's Theology of Liberation. And so you can imagine Xavier University being the only Black Catholic university in the US, why that might seem strange that we start with Gutierrez. But years after I left that place, I asked my teacher why I start there. He said, because y'all already know how Black you are. And you need to engage a perspective that will challenge that. That wisdom came from Charles Long, which was another person that we read at Xavier University in Louisiana. And we read John Sobrino, and we read Ed Correa, and we read Dolores Williams. I wouldn't necessarily take this as a pedagogical moment. So if you're thinking that this is pedagogically cogent for undergrads, you might want to think that. But I want to mention that space in particular because of its influence on some people that some of you in the audience may know, and some people that were used in the seminar. That was also the undergraduate location for Joseph Drexel Dries, who wrote Decolonial Love and Decolonizing Theology with Berg, Stephen Madden, at Notre Dame, comes from Xavier. But they made a wager there. And I think that wager is one of thinking about how the kind of comfortable location in Black spiritualities could be pressed upon and pushed such that it could be conscious of itself. The theology of Gustavo Gutierrez and John Sobrino and Leonardo Ball. Later, as they woke up, Ivan Guevara, Maria Pilar Aquino, others, was essential in trying to help us think through this question that comes up between Cone and Long. And that is, what is the religious experience of the people that you have in question? He called that religious, he named the kind of theological response to that, as I said earlier, the theologies of faith. So it became important to me long after in my graduate studies, because one of the professors there ended up being at Duquesne, Gerald Boodoo, and I ended up going to study with him there. And Steve Madden was the person that introduced me to Anibal Quijano's work in Coloniality and Power. So as a native of Mississippi, the blues were, near and dear to me, and I couldn't understand why Long was still pushing on Cone, because it seemed that the spirituals and the blues was Cone's means of addressing his kind of anemic approach, by Long's estimation, to Black culture and to Black religious experience. And so over the years, I've been looking at the kind of notion of blues that we get out of Cone's work and the kind of pressing upon that iteration of that cultural production. And there are a couple of things that I want to mention as to why decolonial theory was helpful for me thinking through that, and why it continues to be helpful for me today. But the main thing there is, as Nelson has argued, that we have to remember that religion is an anthropological category. And insofar as religion is an anthropological category, right, meaning it is used to name people groups and differentiate them from other people groups, then what of spirituality? Doesn't it have to deal with that same critique to some degree? So I'll return to my text now. So, but in this work, the thing that struck me is the use of these ideas and the way that they've played out, particularly ordinosis, order thinking, cosmological difference, the colonial difference, the coloniality of being, and the decolonial interpretation of religion as a thing we could about, for example, so all gave me language to consider the debates and the tension between Long and the project of Black theology, which was discussed passionately in my undergraduate days. Recently, Victor Anderson has some rather clear language to this tension by focusing in on the debates between Charles Long, a historian of religion, and James Cone. He discusses the challenge that was before them. They're both trying to talk about the matter of reality of God. Long's project tried to talk about it phenomenologically and within the flesh stuff, as he argues, of Black people, where Cone tried to interpret it through theological discourse. Anderson goes on to argue that Cone is given over to what William Hart calls a standard narrative of Black religion that I talked about earlier. In Hart's book, Afro-Ecentricity, he's critical of perspectives in the study of Black religion and Black theology that want to pin religion down such that it always equals what they needed to equal for liberation. And so, for me, that ground is an important thing to look at. So as I began to think through this, the kind of spatial understandings of reality become clear. I think about the plant. If you think about blues, you have to think about the space of the plantation and the enclosure of enslaved Africans in that space. They're forced into a kind of conversation, depending on which theory should go with, a kind of forced situatedness in settler colonialism or forced situatedness in colonialism. And so getting out of that situatedness, sometimes as we think about the spiritualities that hope for an alternative place and how Cone is reading the spirituals, there's a sociological interpretation of the spirituals that was articulated by John Lovell, which says that these are about the contingencies of people in reality trying to deal with the imposition of enslavement and what they might do to resist, right? To be clandestine, right? So Canaan was oftentimes a translation for Canada. And so in the spirituals and the blues, Cone tries to differentiate himself from the sociological study of the spirituals. and from other emphasis on the spirituals. And in some ways, he's answering Long's question about the depth of his understanding of Black religious experiences. In some ways, he's avoiding. So in my work, I tried to think about the blues in conversation with decolonial theory, to think about it cosmologically. And I thought that some of the parts of this cosmology have to do with sound, have to do with land, right? And also has to do with sensuality, flesh. So, to be clear, as if it's not clear by now, I see the study of Black religion as a species of decolonial, as it is articulated by law. Right? So, in the spatial reading of the blues, I attempted to get at this by trying to read the blues in light of decolonial thought, and also the critical geography of Clyde Woods, the blues commentary of Albert Murray, the historical interpretation of blues women by Daphne Duval Harrison, and also the historical interpretation by Angela Davis, her book on blues women. And in this conversation, you begin to hear the songs different. And you also get to be critical, or you have an opportunity to be critical of the reception history of how we even get the spirituals in the first place, right? Which is also, there's a legacy of that reception history in the Lomax family. So we've got Alan Lomax and John Lomax, and they are influenced by a particular interestedness in holding on to the image of the folk, right? And so one example of this is an interview that is conducted with Robert Johnson's mother. And in the interview, they asked him, like, well, what kind of person was Robert Johnson as a blues artist? There's often associated with blues lore, and the whole story goes that he sold his soul to the devil to get musical prowess, and he came back this like wonderful musician. And so when she's asked by Lomax, what do you remember of your son? What's the most fond memory you have of him? He gave his life to the Lord when he died. Lomax runs out. Right? So right there is a kind of ground of two spiritualities coming into contestation with one another. The life of Robert Johnson, all of the music that he provided, right? All of the sonic engagement with the reality and a way of singing and playing the blues that workers on plantations and turpentine camps that were transient, leaving their families often. It sounds like migration and worker culture today. And all of that she could say about him had to do with the saving of his soul, as if he didn't save souls. And while I know that I'm ruining the sentimental story of a mother and a son, this is what's at stake to me in these spiritualities. So I want to push. All right. So I want to bring to the fore why Long, the introduction to Long, gave me a certain sensibility that made it easy for me to follow. I don't know, after listening to Nelson today, I don't know if I've made it going on the train, but I definitely am following. So I'm gonna read a few quotes from Long just to get them in the room. Because my memory is bad. So this is from an essay he wrote entitled Freedom, Otherness, and Religion, Theology's Opaque. And so here's the first one. And here he's talking about power and passivity. He's trying to critique what he calls a power discourse in theology and trying to push theologians to resist that discursive power in theology. Not necessarily resist theology, but discursive power. So they grow out of a realization these theologies opaque, because he names them.
of a primordial meaning of color, and they push this signification into the critical and constructive arena of intellectual construction. Yet they do not wish to claim simple ethnic goals of superiority. They don't want to make blackness the new whiteness. They do not wish to be another and they do not wish to be another and averse example of racism and exclusiveness. In every case, the claim of these theologies is more than an accusation regarding the actions and behavior of the oppressive cultures. It goes to the heart of the issue. So there's some ways in which Black theology, as he was seeing it at that time, was so caught up in critiquing whiteness, right, that it made a caricature out of Blackness that defined it always in relationship to whiteness. Victor Anderson was really critical of this in his book, Ontological Blackness, right? And to connect Nelson to that, one of the ways that Nelson describes modernity is that it is a temporal break from ancestry and an ontological break from the rest of the world. And in some ways, Long was fearful that this way in which Blackness was being understood was going to make an ontological break from the actual people that it claimed to be thinking with and from. Okay. He says, theologies are specific modes of religious discourse that have become overwhelmingly predominant within the Christian church. Theologies are about power, the power of God, but equally about the power of specific forms of discourse about power. These discourses are about the hegemony of power, the distribution and economy of this power in heaven and on earth, whether in ecclesiastical locus of the Pope, or more generally, since the modern period, the center of this power in the modern Western world. This is in the 70s and 80s, he's writing this. It is this kind of power which is attacked in the opaque theologies, for this power has justified and sanctified the oppression in vast numbers of persons in several cultures, subject to economic, military oppression, and transparent to the knowledge of the West. But the punch comes here. If God is red, if Black is beautiful, then this modality of the Godhead has always been the case. And there are those who have lived this testimony. Right? So so in other words, he's leveraging the fact that if God embraces these perspectives, it went there. He's embracing the fact that if God has embraced these perspectives, that God is not temporal. God is not in our time. So if these things are true, if these statements are true in their theological vigor, then this is outside of time. This is in a cosmic notion of time that these things are real. So he says, there is a theology of accusation and opposition, which is to the fore in theology's opinion. But it is precisely at this point that these theologies should not move forward to possess the theological battlefield wrested from their foes. It is at this point that theologies, opaque, must become deconstructive theologies. That is to say, theologies that undertake the destruction of theology as a powerful mode of discourse. The blues, I think, as I have read it, and I have lived it in Atlanta at the CTSA, went to see some blues performance and stole away, is doing this work. And so in my work, I see the blues as distrustful of the power of the sanctifying rituals of churches which repress the flesh. Blues people set out to free hips, feet, hands, and even jelly rolls from the logics of the repressive piety, the negative color symbolism of Blackness, and the grinding Plutonian force of the workday, which never pays out. In the blues, we see Black women emerge from the exploitative labor dynamics of the Jim Crow era. They give complexity to washerwomen and domestics. We learn that wild women don't worry. because they don't have the blues. From Bessie Smith, we learned that queer Black women can do it better than any natural man. We see Roots and Conjure being leveraged for pleasure, rest, love, virtuosity, and tricking the boss. All of this is in a world filled with precarity and destabilization. As Long work suggests, the spirituality of the blues embodies a new religious depth that will be missed if we simply compare it to the power discourses enfolded in theological and secular discourses on modernity. And here I'm thinking about Nelson's critique of these discourses. We should look, listen, and feel its refusal, referring to the blues, that has been made all too transparent, all too vetted by the curators and folk cultural enthusiasts who are drunk with the discourses that obscure more than they reveal. The blues, as Angela Davis argues, enacts a practice of naming. As such, they do not necessarily signal the triumphant telos of freedom. Instead, they do something more subtle. They recover and rethink what R.A. Judy articulates as the sentience of blackened flesh. The power to affirm the goodness of sonic vibrations, touch, sex, pleasure, resistance, self-affirmation, and the fleshiness of intimacy. Why else would Bessie Smith sing, I may not be able to save your soul, but I sure can't tell you how to save your sweet jelly roll? Why would Coco Taylor brag about her godlike prowess? The power to shake hands with the devil and make him crawl in the sand, or associate her sexual powers with her power to make love to crocodiles. We see different orientations articulated in Coco Taylor's moans and shouts that rest in the fleshiness of blues people. Or as she says, I'm a woman, I'm a rushing wind, a love maker, an earth shaker. What kind of spiritual orientation unfolds and enfolds in this flesh and the blood of blues peoples? It is one, perhaps, that generates and regenerates possibilities of delinking from violent ontological capture. And it sounds a lot better than what I just said. Decolonial thinking updates limits in Long and fills out a critical perspective on religion by seeing the category of religion, as I articulated earlier, and secular reason as an anthropological category. Isn't it ironic that this critique of religion as an anthropological category is leveraged at an intra-racial level? Awesome.
Hi, everyone. So I titled my presentation, Decolonial Spiritualities of the Existent, Women Rebuilding Life and Meaning After Rape and Sexual Abuse in Catholic Contexts. I'm very cognizant that I'm talking about a sensitive issue. 1 out of 3 women in the world, as far as we know, have suffered some form of sexual violence in their lives. 1 out of 4 men, so that could also be true about our group. So I just want to acknowledge that to start, and in some sense, like send a trigger alert for those who were survivors. Okay, so I want to, so basically, I've been working on my dissertation and talking with women survivors of sexual abuse within the Catholic Church, and particularly from Chile, that's my country of origin. And I want to divide my presentation in 3 stages. First, I want to speak a little bit about the context in which the spiritualities of survival and resistance emerge. Then I want to show you a little video, and that handout that it's circulating is like the translation of the words that are used in that video, to show you like a small vignette, one story of one of these women. And finally, draw some conclusions about how a spirituality of re-existence looks like for women who are dealing with a past of sexual abuse in their lives, and particularly within the Catholic Church. So the first thing to say about the context is that there's pre-connected crises that allowed for the voices of sexual abuse victims and survivors to emerge in Chilean society with enough strength to make us think that we're confronting a systemic issue. So this is not just an individual problem, this is a systemic issue. And that consciousness in Chilean society, I think, has emerged from three fronts. One front is the sexual abuse crisis in the Catholic Church that exploded in Chile in 2010, and with much more strength in 2018 when Pope Francis visited Chile. He made a few mistakes that offended a lot of survivors, and after that, it was a cascade of cases in the newspaper. Every day, every week, you will hear a new story, someone else coming out, each story more horrific than the previous one. So that's one historical event that's still ongoing. The second one was a crisis in SENAME, Servicio Nacional de Menores. So this is a public institution that's in charge of children under the protection of the state. A lot of SENAME homes are actually trusted to the church. So even though they work with public money, they're run by the church, so it's connected. And so there was a big crisis around SENAME in 2016 after Lisette Vergara, 11 years old, is found dead in one of these centers. This generated a big scandal and statewide investigations that confronted Chile with the abuse and neglect against children under the protection of the state, including sexual abuse, human trafficking, and you name it, the whole package. And finally, a third one is the feminist movement in Chile. Feminism has had many waves, and in this last iteration of feminism being a social movement in Chile, it started in May 2018, mainly in universities, college students, denouncing different forms, again, of sexual violence and abuse within colleges and institutions. And it became massive in 2019 during what we know and now call estallido social, big massive protests of many different issues at the same time in the streets of Santiago, and moved beyond students to include women of all ages and contexts, denouncing sexual violence in homes, schools, workplaces, and all spheres of society. So while these three different events or crises can seem disconnected, they have much in common. They are all examples of public surfacing of voices of victims and survivors that were silenced and ignored for decades. Their very voices have made us aware of spaces within the church, the state, and society where human dignity is being trampled and abused. The truth of victims of clerical abuse, of SENAME victims, and of women who have experienced sexual violence and discrimination left the repressed shadows of social existence, moving into the light of public truth-telling and discussion, putting an end to decades of silence and solitary sufferings. Thus, the silence and fear of abused women, children, and young adults have turned into a scandal, and the scandal gave rise to protest, and the protest has become a productive space where new forms of solidarity among women and other victims have emerged, and where urgent demands for institutional and cultural change have surfaced. All these connected crises give witness to the perverse ways in which toxic masculinity, power, and sexuality intersect to the detriment of the dignity of women, children, and other groups of marginalized and oppressed people. So, according to Daniela Eltit, a Chilean very famous writer, she says Chile is undergoing a crisis of male leadership, with expressions in different systems where male power is allocated. For her, the ecclesial scandals were one of the first symptoms of a society that no longer wanted to suffer from abusive power dynamics in silence. So the scandals automatically generated a certain inability to continue leading with a customary censorship that permeated and exercised a sexual pedagogy against women throughout the entire social spectrum. Both the crisis in the church and the feminist movement generated a space that allowed women to reflect and organize on their own terms, recognizing that abuse of power is an acute and unresolved problem present in all spheres of Chilean society. And finally, the other thing that these different crises have in common is that they represent local expressions of global trends. So clerical, sexual, and power abuse is not a particularity of the Chilean church, but a widespread phenomena within the Catholic community with global proportions. Conversely, sexual violence and discrimination against women are not a particularity of Chilean culture and institutions, but something that women worldwide experience in similar yet particular ways. Thus, the Chilean Mayo Feminista and its aftermath cannot be understood without referring to similar movements such as Me Too in the United States, Ni Una Menos in Argentina, Peru, Mexico, and other forms of protest that have emerged all over the globe. So just an illustration of that interconnection. This is a project of female students outside in the Casa Central of the Pontifical University in Chile. I think the image speaks for itself. In some sense, these are young women challenging the power of patriarchy present in the Catholic Church, right? So, okay, so now let's go to this particular story. So I decided to focus my own research on the stories of women survivors of rape and sexual abuse within the Catholic Church. And in conducting my interviews, I feel I'm touching the sacred ground of women's stories of suffering and resilience, and learning from them how to survive and be fully alive again. Also, I'm addressing the particular issue of how sexual violence within the church influences and changes the way in which women engage with their own spiritualities and faith. Most trauma experts from the area of psychology affirm that sexual violence in general, as other human encounters with violence and death, can generate big faith crises in its victims. Still, they tend to agree that having faith and belonging to faith communities can be a powerful resource that help develop resilience and foster healing. Still, this path of rebuilding faith and community is especially arduous and difficult for victims of sexual violence within the church, because when the abuser is a priest or a powerful church authority, most victims find their faith completely shattered and perversely deformed and damaged by the manipulative use of religious authority, words, symbols, and even sacraments by the abusers. Thus, previous religious experience that was life-giving becomes a reminder of the violence lived rather than vehicles of grace and life. If the community and/or the institution ignores or rejects the witness of the survivors, which sadly still happens in most cases, the survivors also lose her community of belonging. Community networks and institutions that again were considered life-giving and protective become suspicious and dangerous, creating a distance between the survivor and the church that is sometimes impossible to overcome. It's what some authors have called sanctuary trauma, which happens when traumatic experiences happen in places or communities that are recognized by societies as sanctuaries of care and protection in which we are allowed to be vulnerable, such as churches, hospitals, and other places. So women who have experienced sexual abuse within the church face particular challenges that as a feminist theologian, I thought necessary to address if we're going to have a meaningful word to say in the midst of this crisis. Also, it is important to say that despite the power of sexual violence and profound damage that it generates, women remain creative and resilient, and most of them develop alternative forms of spirituality and community that help them not only to survive, but even thrive again as full human beings. Those sources of strength and life push women survivors to re-exist in ways that allow them to change the forces of patriarchy that sought to destroy them, affirm their own dignity, find renewed spiritualities, both outside and inside the Christian faith, and demand deep systemic changes in communities and institutions. So I want to introduce you to one of these stories that can provide us from a different perspective to approach the topic of decolonial spiritualities. I would like to state that for spirituality to be decolonial, it has to deal with the dismantling of patriarchy and its dominant lies as an essential element of the system of power that this current of thought is trying to dismantle. So coloniality cannot be understood without fully considering patriarchy, as the latter is an expression of the evil of patriarchal power, which is even older and at the foundations of modern colonial domination. So the story and performance of Marcela can offer us a window to discuss how this dismantling happens in the bodies of women who confront sexual oppression in varied forms. I can speak openly about her because she made her case public and she has become an activist in the cause against sexual violence. This is not true of all survivors. So I come with her permission to tell her real name and show you this video that's from her authorship. When Marcela was a child, she was sexually abused by a priest, her school chaplain, and one of her parents' best friends. She buried the memory of this abuse deep in her conscience until in 2019, she saw and heard the performance of La Tesis, a feminist collective that made a public intervention on the streets based on the thought of Rita Laura Segato and her thesis about patriarchy and about violence. This performance had a huge impact all over the world. And in the case of Marcela, it opened her eyes to the sexual violence that had shaped her life since she was a child. And it gave her strength to start a process of denouncing this priest publicly in social media first, and then formally, both in state and ecclesial tribunal. When she was doing this, she realized that her case was prescrito in español, or subjected to what United States call a statute of limitations. I also used in the handout the word prescribed as a synonym, but I know that it's not like frequently, even though it is a synonym in English, it's not frequently used that way here, but it's the same thing as the statute of limitations. So basically, in Chile, until 2019, crimes like sexual abuse and rape against children were prescribed after 5 or 10 years before the victim turned 18 years old. Thus, if the survivor took too long to start a legal process against her perpetrator, the prosecutor was no longer able to investigate and bring the perpetrator to a trial. This law changed in 2019 after the efforts of a lot of survivors, but that doesn't change the reality for most of them. So this is a change that applies from 2018 onwards. So it will protect future generations, but doesn't help us repair the damage experienced by past generations. So today in Chile, rape and sexual abuse against children is considered a crime that doesn't prescribe, is not submitted to a statute of limitations, just as human rights violations and crimes against humanity. There is no statute of limitations for this type of crime. But the application of this new law is not retroactive. So Marcela found herself denouncing a crime that civil courts cannot judge, and that's the context of this public intervention portrayed in this video. You can follow the lyrics in the handout. It's in Spanish, but I provided an English translation.
No estoy prescrita. Soy una causa que camina, sigo presente y vulnerable.
Caducos son el sistema, el fiscal, los jueces, los cómplices y complacientes.
Existe la ignorancia, la obediencia que lleva a su vida y al baile del desacuerdo.
Soy una causa que arde, que enciende la confianza lúcida, esa que no se volverá a distraer.
La que perseguirá sus derechos para sanar y reparar. Soy una llama que quema al propio violador. Un gran ventana para reparar. Los conversados valientes y sonrientes. Sus cuerpos heridos están limpios y les sale a los vasos de agua. Somos mujeres, hermanos. Somos una causa. Y juntos paramos a decir, el fuego ya no tiene, ahora somos allá.
No estoy bien, soy feliz.
Quiero presentarme en tu relación y esconderte en mi inocencia mía. Y civil ya no arrancará.
Okay, so every time I see this video, it gets me very emotional. I want to acknowledge that before I go to my last part. So 3 points of spirituality of the existence that emerge from this story and from this poetic performance, and also from other stories that I've been working with. The first thing is, so who's dead and who's alive? And the inversion and subversion of roles and powers in discourse. So who's prescribed, who's dead, who's outdated, and who's still alive, fury, and present? Who's being protected by prescription or statutes of limitations? Crimes can be prescribed legally, but they aren't prescribed in the bodies of women who have lived through them. With this type of intervention, women are reclaiming the realm of life for themselves after experiencing death. We tend to think that patriarchy is alive and well, a powerful living source that shapes our institutions and relationships, a powerful living reality that reproduces itself from generation to generation. What Marcela is telling us is that patriarchy and its institutions are really those who are dead, and the victim survivors are those who are truly alive and are challenging with their very life, with their very survival, the structures of power that made them victims in the first place. So their survivorship is a witness of the death-dealing nature of patriarchy and the vitality and resilience of life, of women's life, that persist in affirming their own dignity and courage in confrontation with the evils who try to call her into silence, death, and submission. So that's the first point, this inversion of who's alive and who's really dead, that I think shapes this spirituality. The second one is that a spirituality of the existence needs to be a post-traumatic spirituality, because there's still the persistence of death and shame in all of these stories. So a post-traumatic spirituality that takes into account the persistence of suffering, the spiritual and bodily memory of its victims, saying, no estoy prescrita, means also that I'm still alive, but also I still carry the wounds of my trauma in my body. And those wounds aren't healed just because time has passed, or the crimes are not over just because the law says so. So survivors push us to have a spirituality that doesn't rush into easy reconciliations with the past, or invites too easily to forgive and forget. We re-exist with a lived memory of the forces that tried to kill us and throw us into non-existence. Just like the resurrected Christ, women survivors of sexual abuse carry the mark of the wounds with them. Healing becomes an incomplete and open process, and trauma theory and trauma studies can help us to understand that better. All women who I've interviewed so far have had to deal with the different health issues, and mostly mental health issues. PTSD is the main long-term mental health issue that women continue to experience for the rest of their lives. As the expert on trauma, Judith Herman, has affirmed, most post-traumatic disorders in society come not only, like the most visible ones, especially here in the US, is men in war, but the most invisible and most massive is women in civilian life. So, and the problem is that still the value of privacy in regards to family life, to sexuality, has rendered this dimension of the prevalence of trauma in our society practically invisible. Feminists in the early 60s called this the problem without a name, and brought the issue of sexual violence against women and children to the forefront of collective and political consciousness for the first time. Because of these mental health issues that are a consequence of trauma and abuse, victims have been labeled as crazy, hysterical, exaggerated, or inventing their stories. Also, mental health issues prevent many women from actively engaging in activism around this cause. Shame also plays a role, especially when it comes to abuse within the church, which continue to be a place in which women, especially if they were adults at the time of their abuse, are blamed for it or not taken seriously. Just an example, canon law doesn't even have a definition of rape as a crime that involves adults. The only category that was recently added is a category of vulnerable adult that's very ambiguous. because who's not vulnerable, honestly. And the other change is that the age of consent has been raised from 14 to 18 years old. This is a step that is completely insufficient as it leaves young people, particularly women, unprotected. If you're over 18 years of age, you're considered responsible and completely able to consent, which doesn't take into account the differential of power that comes from a deeply hierarchical structure that situates priests and consecrated religious over the laity, not only in terms of actual power, but also in terms of credibility and institutional protection. So, one of Gabriel Rosenthal, who is an anthropologist and expert in using qualitative interview methods with survivors from acute trauma, affirms that the main difference between survivors of political or war trauma and the survivors of sexual or intimate violence is shame. Shame so frequently prevents women from speaking out, sharing their experiences, and engaging in political or public activism against sexual and patriarchal forms of violence in society and the church. The feminist movement and organizations of survivors in general have done much work to undo these mechanisms of shame. Still, its power cannot be taken lightly. War survivors, again, especially in this country, and survivors of political violence are treated as heroes. We have a big repertoire of collective ritual texts, art, even public landmarks and memorials that allow us to make sense of and process the trauma and violence collectively. Women survivors and children survivors of sexual violence don't have any of that. Shame and stigma are still very powerful and prevent us from collectively dealing with trauma and name this form of violence. So a post-traumatic spirituality will address the persistent nature of the pain and the shame, and will work patiently to undo it, knowing that it's not a linear process, but rather a circular and sometimes frustrating process of moving forward and being pulled back by debilitating memories and persistent forms of violence and societal forms of denial of the severity of this endured trauma. And then the last point is self-affirmation and solidaridad is solidarity among women, as a path towards awakening and conversion. So a spirituality of re-existence for survivors needs to ask itself, what wakes us up? That was the first question in Guadalajara, right? What calls us back to life? In the case of Marcela, it was the performance of the thesis and the feminist movement that provided her with conceptual and spiritual tools to name what happened to her and to reinterpret her faith in light of the experience she suffered. Learning to love the self was key in her process. Ama al prójimo como a ti mismo. Love your neighbor as yourself is one of the sentences that Marcela grew up hearing and applying to her own life. She learned from her Catholic parents to be always at the service of others. Service helps her to get out of herself, of her pain, and engage with the needs of others. If not, in her own words, she will be just crying every day. But belonging to circles of women has allowed her to realize that there's a second part of that sentence, love your neighbor as yourself. So she realized that the experience of abuse and her education as a woman in general had deprived her from love to the self, and that she needed to invert the phrase, love yourself, then the neighbor. Don't use the neighbor to hide from your own pain. Love yourself and make space for your own needs and your own healing. We are love, and if we love ourselves, we can communicate that love to others more eloquently as well. In these, survivors like Marcela are in line with one of the founding debates in feminist theology, which refers to the love of self and self-affirmation not as a path towards pride and sinfulness, but as a path towards conversion for women who have been excessively trained to be selfless and who so frequently lose their own identity and dignity in trying to please others. She says that she doesn't participate in the church anymore because the church demanded her silence and submission, but she considers herself a follower of Jesus and a Christian in the sense that she feels deep bonds of solidarity with all of those who suffer, and that this is something that she learned from her Catholic parents and from her church. But at the same time, she's living out that faith in different collective spaces, especially with communities of other women. It's the same spirit, just a different space. The same calling, only phrased in a different order, that allows us to remember that we must love ourselves if we're going to love our neighbor. So, just to end, there is something deeper that sustains life that is bigger than all the violence that has been perpetrated against women. That is women's dignity and humanity sustained in the God of life, who calls us into being and loves us deeply. That love expressed in this pull towards self-affirmation of victims whose existence and dignity has been denied by systemic violence is what Christians call God. This is what survivors discover when they wake up to the wounds and the abundant life they carry in their very selves. So finally, when asked about the difference between men and women survivors, my interviewees have agreed, all of them, without coordinating among themselves, on this salient element that has surprised me. While men seem to be more articulate in the public sphere and can manage the intricacies of the judicial and canonical systems, dealing with the systems of power with greater lucidity, they seem to be more alone and with less tools to find intimate and community support to deal with their pain. Women, on the contrary, feel more accompanied by other women. They speak about solidarity amongst women, survivors or not, as one of the main pillars of their survival and healing. The feminist movement has a lot to do with this collective awakening of this solidaridad, but just classic and regular female friendship is a pillar as well. When the family or the church fails, there's always a friend, a sister that will pray for you and support you no matter what. These relationships are the starting point of a new belonging to a community in which awakening happens. Shame loses its power and life is revealed not only individually but collectively, grounding the survivor spirituality in a shared space of community, collective resilience, and hope. Thank you.
Thank you all for your rich and thoughtful contributions. We now invite Dr. Ernesto Maldonado-Torres to offer a response.
Can I actually do it there? After being so long sitting down during the day, my knees and legs will appreciate that. Is it working? If not, yes. Well, yeah, this is a. Well, thanks so much. We're at the last mile of these activities. It's so great to be with you in the setting, sharing ideas, and having the privilege of both speaking, but also doing my best to deeply listen to all the presentations and give you some constructive feedback that could hopefully help to continue the conversation and the thinking through these complex, difficult, and very important issues. I want to once again do this more or less in the order in which you presented. And I'd like to, the question of spirituality came up also in the previous panel. Remember that there was, and I felt that maybe provided a kind of working definition of spirituality, which I think is very much in dialogue with what you were going both with the liberation, spirituality, and what it has in common with decolonial. I think we are thinking right on that line. And actually, it struck me that when you describe the three moments that you observe in the decolonial spirituality, the first one being the awaken, the despertar, that reminded me, in my own work, I've been trying to, develop the idea of the decolonial attitude and the decolonial turn, but the notion of the decolonial turn is a shift in attitude. It's that kind of despertar, it's right, that moment of beginning where when the person who has been facing dehumanization and who has been taught to see themselves as a problem, realizes that the problem is not them, is very Western modernity, right? The setting, that is the problem. And therefore you become a questioner of the problem, right? You become an agent. That's the kind of the shift that exists. That also, I mean, as I draw in my work, I mean, the co-chair of the Fanon Foundation, I draw from Fanon's work quite a bit. And, he was a psychiatrist, he was trying to discern these moments, to map it, right? So that's how I think Fanon has been so influential to, from Freirean pedagogy, but ultimately, I think now to a bunch of community psychologists and psychologists. And I think it has, this is what I've been trying to do for a while, bring out the spiritual dimension and also to some extent theological elements in Fanon's thinking, which is informing this analysis. So that could be, for me, that would be a way to triangulate with what you were doing there, adding that other perspective. But I wanted, I'm going to do something that may not be popular, may put me in the cross sides. Please be gentle with me. Which is to invite us, provoke us, even if only 1 hour and a half. You don't have to do it for the rest of the day, right? To engage in a real critical thinking about the idea of resilience. Mm-hmm. And I bring it because the second aspect is the praxis of healing and resilience. And I realize that it is mobilized by many movements, right? I just wonder exactly, and I would like to do this is an authentic, research. Where and when exactly the movements began to adopt this terminology? Which movements, when, how it is circulated, right? Because of course it has been already a tool and concept. Many NGOs and the state and international NGO organizations have been mobilizing that movement. In the Caribbean has been very strongly, for example, in the context of the major earthquakes in Haiti, right? And people living and subsisting, that was mobilized to talk about the capacity of Haitian people to bounce back, to come back, right? To continue their lives and so on. In Puerto Rico, we have a massive hurricane destroying, right? And so again, resilience was mobilized, sometimes adopted by movements themselves that began to see themselves in that light. Of course, I mean, I don't think that the movements do it themselves. As I was saying before, right? We cannot romanticize the ordinary life, and we cannot romanticize anything that a movement does. It doesn't mean that it's necessarily upon reflection. It could be a good tool, but there could also be problematic. I mean, we're all thinking about this together, and there's no authentic, pure source of decolonized knowledge. So all of us are doing our best in this process. And I realize, and I know the argument for trying to capture the notion of resilience, but I remain deeply worried about it. Partly, I mean, and other scholars have also bring out the notion that this course of resilience mobilizes a number of things, right? And it can easily turn into a counter-combative notion, because what you are not, celebrating is the condition of people who withstand extremely difficult conditions. And so what you're realizing is that, and that condition is ongoing, but then every time what you're talking is the resilience, the ability that they are not there. I mean, that they have not disappeared, that they are still there. But when the question should be a judgment on the systems that are asking to try to survive in the first place, right? So there seems to be, and it's almost like some would call it, it's like a badge of honor that is sometimes put on oppressed peoples for having been able to survive, to exist, to survive. It's connected to survivorship. But to what extent, I mean, these people are simply surviving, to what extent there are at least some dimensions that are really deeply combating. Right? Those structures are never simply succeed or survive. They remain in combat. And actually, I think partly the category of combativity, intention also, and I say a kind of a different category from resilience. There's also, it can even be worse than that, because when you introduce the category of resilience, some scholars have argued that it introduces this question of survival of the fittest, and it connects with the Darwinian tradition, because who survives and who doesn't? So what does it mean if you were annihilated? that you were not resilient enough? Right? And then what if you survive? What does it mean to think about resilience? What is it talking to survive, but how and what, right? And sometimes it can condone some kind of passivity on subjects that should be, conformed that they survive. And it has multiple ramifications that I think need to be examined very, very carefully. So of course, for me, the decolonial, let's say, spirituality, to the extent which I would be concerned by connecting it with resilience, for what that means. Remember that, in the context of COVID, in the context of the major crisis of COVID, the institutions were shutting down, universities were shutting down, coincided with, Black Lives Matter, the second explosion. And you see, interesting, these institutions, liberal institutions, were very interesting laboratories to see how they managed that. And on the one hand, they were doing two things, basically. Statements of solidarity, not solidarity, acknowledgement that Black Lives Matter. Right? We acknowledge, we actually do not deny it. Right? Acknowledge. And we need to celebrate the resilience of our academic communities and our students in face of these social pressures and changes, and in face of COVID, in face of COVID too. So I think a liberal hegemonic institution, majority white and white control, is celebrating its resilience, itself, and say, what is this discourse actually doing? Or, what is authorizing? What is prohibiting? What is stopping? How is entangled with power? So, whereas the Black Lives Matter, right? It's not a matter of the Black Lives Matter. It's not a celebration of the resilience of Black community. It's a position, as the movement for Black Lives has it, in opposition to the war, endless war on Black people. Okay. So why these institutions do not embrace the combative spirit of Black Lives Matter and instead translate it into a resilience discourse? They are very happy, and not only that, in the universities, happening in many universities, and granting funding, agencies that provide grants and funds and so on, they were inviting and welcoming all proposals having to do with the resilience of peoples. Right? You could not do anything without mobilizing that word in that context to get some funding. But why? And why that term? What is that happening? And so I think that partly is a partial and mistranslation of the combative dimension that is coming from these social movements, and the way that it reflects in a convenient manner is translated is through some notion, in this case of resilience. So resilience serves as a, I'm not saying that there may not be other elements that is not possible to mobilize it differently. What I'm saying is that we have to grapple with this complexity of the concept and use it, then we can, right? Now, I'm wondering whether in the blues, where we're talking, I was thinking in the blues, I don't hear, it's not about resilience. There are so many other elements right there, right? And you did not use it, right? You did not convene the term. And I think that, I want to think about decolonial spirituality also. And I think in the African diaspora and African context, you cannot think about decolonial spiritualities without thinking about sound and music and rhythms and percussion, for example. Sure. I want to call attention to how in the video that I showed this morning by La Colectiva, they chose to start with the rhythm of the drums coming from afar, and that introducing little by little, emerging the subversive sound, the beating of the drum. And Louis Gordon has made this profound, he's a drummer too, and he has made this profound comment about how maybe in the very formations of meaning and experience of us as human beings, what we hear is the drumming of the heart of the mother. We feel it inside the womb. And so, if so, we can see the rhythms and the extension of drumming as an extension of that primordial beat, right? That is calling for life. It's a form of communication, of engagement, of affirming something is, there is life when you find a rhythm, right, some kind like that, it might be life. But that is a combative spirituality in that, right, is in preparation also for combat, is cultivating. And then what it shows is they standing a number of women, young women from the movements. And they're standing with different symbols and slogans of different social movements and political that preceded that. That's where the ancestors come in and the previous movement. Right? So you see the whole entry through sound, you enter in that rhythm that connects you with your ancestors. And you are building community with your ancestors as a precondition of you coming out, going out there and putting your body on the street. So the spirituality, it is as Professor Hernandez was saying this morning, the body there is crucial. They were calling for the right, we're putting our body on the streets. But that body is being prepared in a way by the rhythms, by the sounds, by the decolonial aesthetics and spirituality that facilitates the opening up of that body. This is something that appears also in, you see in, and this is some work that I developed in terms of decolonial aesthetics and spirituality in conversation also with Fanon, who concludes the Black Skin, White Mask with a prayer to his body, to make of him someone who questions. And the prayer can be seen as partly a performance, a preparation of the self to be able to question, for the body not to be closed down, but to be able, that body to really be open in the middle of the street, wherever you are, so that you can actually rebirth, right, re-exist by that opening. But then the colonial aesthetics and spirituality might be forms of preparing the body for that transformation, and then accompanying that transformation and cultivating it all through the process. That's why I would say decolonial spirituality and aesthetics are linked, fundamentally linked. They have to do with transformation of the subjectivity and of the way in which we relate to our bodies and and with others. And music is absolutely crucial in that music performance visual. The aesthetics can be seen as an extension of the prayer to one's body, to make oneself people who questions. In this extent, it seems that decolonial spirituality and aesthetics are preconditions for the emergence of decolonial epistemology. Now, maybe that's part of the invitation that, along with decolonial, spirituality and sound, that there is our reflections on decolonial aesthetics that may be good to have in mind to thematize and flesh out, no pun intended, some of the insights in your work around sound and spirit. Now, when we turn to the last presentation, and of course I've made some comments about resilience already, which appears prominently there. There I have two kind of comments. One is that I felt very close to part of your presentation because it's been, I theorized coloniality as a naturalization of war, of practices of war. And in the context of discovery, conquest, expansion of the West, war became naturalized, and war became adopted kind of, it became fixed. It's a permanent feature of societies that then became states. And there are two elements of that paradigm of war that undergirds Western modernity that are very linked with coloniality and that affects particular forms of bodies. And one of them is the practice of torture. And Fanon wrote that the colonial system, modern colonial system, is an extension of torture, right? That ultimately, even more than death, that's a difference that I have also, maybe with some of the reflections about death in coloniality, that torture goes, he's talking about experiences that ultimately are worse than death. And where you're maintained alive for a particular torture or throughout misery, extended misery, can be particular, right? And Fanon says colonialism is actually linked more with torture than even with just necropolitics or death by itself. Is the torture a connection? But then the other one is rape. Right? And rape and torture have been mobilized, particularly in the context, and this is something that Puntland Kola in South Africa has thematized, that is being particularly brutal in the context of colonial expansion. So one cannot simply say, oh, war has always, yeah, it has always, but you can see a kind of particular emphasis in these two practices when war was connected with conquest, right? And the complete dehumanization of a people. Why? Because you allow yourself to do things to those bodies that before you would be much more cautious, because there were certain laws that regulated war and so on. But the fundamental distinction between the dehumanized and the humanized abrogates those laws. So therefore, these practices can reign, right, uninhibited. Finally, and some other points where I want to finish. So there is basically point there, right? I think to develop also a decolonial account of rape, right? As to rape with coloniality, and you partly try to do this in a way by linking patriarchy and the colonial and coloniality. There I have a few concerns, and that's a debate going on in the colonial feminism. But if you look at it at least from the perspective of Oyeron Koyewumi and Maria Lugones, they would caution that, you know, the universalization of patriarchy is problem. We cannot take it for granted, right? And might be part of the very colonial construct and has become an edifice, particularly of white feminism, not only, but particularly of white feminism. There is, again, room to discuss, and not all people in that area agree with that, but there is still, even in the ones, I think, like Rita Segato, who would take a different position, I think there's still a recognition that it's not like, and it's also a debatable thing, but even if there is patriarchy, we're not talking about the same kind of, like, it can be a flattening experience altogether. So there's much more work and subtlety that are needed there. Now, the more problematic aspect, I think, and that's why I would not go necessarily there to see the linkage between coloniality and patriarchy. There, you know, it will have to be asserted, I think, in a different way. But what I am more concerned is that I was waiting to see in your presentation, maybe you can comment on this. Particularly when you're trying to address the topic of decolonial spirituality, right, and decoloniality in general, that I was waiting to hear more about the specific situation of Mapuche women and of the Mapuche in Chile. Even to some basic questions like, does the sorority of Chilean women extend to indigenous women, and does that sorority mean that they assume Mapuche, some basic principles of the Mapuche struggle and the history in front of the Chilean state, right? And in a way, you know, I think that failing to distinguish the fundamental difference between white mestiza women or Black and indigenous women on the other can become easily an extension of the colonial paradigm and prevents actually a very explicit and direct decolonial strategy that would assume the end of the entire system of domination, oppression, of rape, but including an end to the coloniality of the Chilean state itself. So that would be kind of a different, that is a decolonial engagement with the questions of victims of rape and survivors. I think that somehow would have to take into consideration, again, the long history of the state and the multiple forms of dehumanization and breaking communities apart that it generates, because ultimately that's the engine of war that produces the torture and rape. So I guess it will be a question of how maybe to revisit some of the principles of mestiza, white mestiza feminism in Latin America. And I think that decolonial feminism offers elements to disentangle, to further question some of these bases. And in the analysis, to somehow bring more of the multi-layer battle against coloniality. And this is a work that many of the decolonial feminists I was talking about yesterday, and that we translated in this book, that they assume the feminist struggle as a multi-layer struggle that necessarily involves an anti-imperial and anti-colonial posture, very explicitly and strongly. Thank you. I'll leave it there.
Thank you. Thank you so much for your acute and illuminating responses. We now have about 10-15 minutes for questions, comments from this.
Can you hear me? Thank you very much. I think that my first comment has to do with this notion. I know you're talking about women in Chile. Just curious whether you also factor trans women in Chile. Yeah, and I think that's what Nelson was also trying to talk about when he's talking about the multi-layers. That said, I'm thinking of, for all the presenters, when talking about decolonial spirituality. If, let's use the Catholic Church, for example, as an institution, a religion, that within itself, it produces a pathway or the possibility for the rituals or the spirituality rituals to emerge and all that. But we know that historically, that the church itself appropriated the patriarchal vision of society and the world from the Roman Empire. And insofar as it still embodies this political posturing in the world, it will always sacralize patriarchal tendencies or narratives that of division, that fragment. And this way I've become dangerous in my question, or the question might be a bit problematic if I don't care. Yeah, in the sense that, how far would you go with this decolonial spirituality to upend ecclesial structures, ecclesiology, sacramental imagination, doctrinal teachings, dogmas, and all that stuff, and all the matrix that form this so-called reality called Catholic Church or religion? How far would you go with that? And what will be the pushback? Who will dare to go that path? Thank you.
But I want to apologize because I was late, so I was not able to listen to all the presentations. But I wanted to ask to the last presenter probably a personal question. I'm always curious when I hear these presentations. How would you work listening to testimonies of women that have affected your relationship with the Catholic Church, your own relationship with the Catholic Church? If you continue, it's always, because I'm a church person, it always pulled my attention how these spaces of criticism within the feminist theologies still is within the institutions, where in Jesuits. That was one question. And the second one is related with decoloniality and coloniality. If I feel that because of it wasn't the title of the event, but I don't clearly see in what sense, how can we see this coloniality? Because it's linked to patriarchal, of course, but how can we see what is the aspects of this coloniality and what is the aspect of the decolonial by going to their own spirituality? If you can just give us a little bit more elements of how this works.
Thank you all so much for your really vulnerable and thoughtful presentations, and each is very key. My first sort of comment is in response to Nelson's discussion about resiliency, because it seems like there's a way in which how you were talking about resiliency also mirrors a kind of politics of recognition in which institutions are able to acknowledge aspects of combative resistance to modes of suffering without actually addressing any kind of structural change. But then on the other side, in thinking with Soledad's presentation on the question of trauma, so much of resiliency, at least in trauma studies, is tied to the category of life, I think that Soledad is recognizing, in which the survival is not the end of the story of someone who has experienced rape or experienced certain kinds of trauma. What is the question of thriving? And so I think resiliency is working a little bit differently in that literature, and that's worth thinking about in the decolonizing of the language. But I did have a question that it seemed like each one of you in a certain way was struggling with the tension of category of anthropology and theology. And I was struck by the first presentation on the question of Schneider's and McGinn's different models for how to think about spirituality. And I wondered to myself, through each of the presentations, whether or not what we're talking about is not sort of anthropology as a boost to theology, but a reimagination from theological categories that are also attentive to the historical model, which is then allowing the anthropological questions to emerge. And so I wondered if you three were satisfied with those models that were offered, or if you would consider your work as falling into one of those or another.
Just a quick anecdote. So I was there for the picture, and when they were
Which one?
in front of the John Paul II.
Oh.
Yeah, I was there, and the women that participated there were all persecuted. Some of them were expelled of the university. We couldn't do it. Some friends of mine were in cases and stuff. My question, and it's very related to my anecdote, is, and I think theology has reflected a little bit on this, and it's related to the combative notion that Nelson has been sharing with us these days. So my question is, how do we combatants kind of dream at the same time that we are aware of the cost of the fight?
Thank you all. I have a bit of a related comment, especially so that your discussion of the 3 points of resistance, the call to wake up, and then in terms of looking at the experience of rape or the experience of abuse, I wonder if there isn't also a moment, like, because I've worked with women who have lost daughters in feminicide, for example. These are all very significant traumas. And isn't there a moment often of women either being frozen or traumatized or so enraged? And that we can't shut that down with language of resilience or, healing or what, that kind of, in a way, it doesn't allow a moment for that rage to be there and be what it is, or the experience of being frozen by the grief and the trauma that has happened. And it would seem to me that there isn't a possibility necessarily of resistance until that has its moment in its day. And for some, it takes a long time. For others, maybe they're able to move through it for various reasons more quickly. But it would seem that also, the rage and just the experience of it needs its due in order for there ultimately to be some kind of resistance.
Yes, it's okay.
Yeah.
So that gives you some time.
Okay.
You have so many.
I know.
5 seconds. I have First, about the question of resilience. It is a good point. I think I take it. When I think about resilience, I think about how do we identify the resources that we have, personal, communal resources that allows us to go the long haul? How do we nurture that? And that for me, it's I grew up with liberation theology, and I grew up having many promises made. The church, my movements, and it is very difficult to go back to my country and, talk to the people and say, you got to stay. And then I think about, and I have a very short memory, then I think of my African American brothers in the United States, and I think the long haul. So for me, those is more that question. I don't know what terminology is important, but we need to learn, and sometimes we cannot change things. So what do we do then? How do we nurture a community that can continue to flourish even in the stage of siege? So that's that. But I'm not contradicting what you said. I realize the issue. Regarding different rituals, I'm not a liturgist either, but rituals, expressions of the community are gonna continue to take place as long as they make sense to the community. There is gonna be a moment that we're gonna say, I don't need to fast for 24 hours before I take the Eucharist. Doesn't make sense. Okay? And I hope that that the same thing is happening, with patriarchal issues. My wife is a Protestant pastor. I love to go and pray the Our Father, Our Mother. Think these changes. We're moving. Religion. Religion is problematic, but Christianity is alive. It's constantly changing. We also have, remember, not only the tradition that comes from Rome, but we have popular religion. And that's important, which also has its dangers. But there are different sources that we can, one of the wonderful things of the Catholic tradition, with many problems that it has, but it's the richness that we have. We have a thick tradition. And I think that's good. I don't remember what else. I wrote a couple of things.
Okay, so there were many questions for me. I'm thankful for them because I'm starting to think about these things, and it helps a lot to have different perspectives. So first, I want to say that maybe I agree with what Sarah was saying, that my use of resilience has to do, and maybe connected to this idea of the heartbeat, that I just realized that it's both like in the rhythms that you were talking about, and it was part of the video, like the sound that was in the background was heartbeat. So I guess like the concept of resilience, I also think about how it could come, as you described it, even from engineering. Like I come from a country of earthquakes. So having a resilient building is a building flexible enough to survive in those earthquakes and stay standing. And I see, of course, the dangers of, if resilience is just endurance, it's like surviving multiple earthquakes without being moved, that's not what we need. Because it's finally a category that prevents change. And I agree with you as you say that like we have to be suspicious. I've like a couple of books about resilience. I just haven't been able to go through the third or fourth page because I think they're just preaching on endurance, solely on that, and hindering like this other side of resistance and fighting against the evil that put you there in the first place. And I think for me, this idea of connecting resilience with life is precisely as survivors being able to connect to the part of us that's still alive and drawing strength from that, to be able to fight against those forces of evil, of death that are threatening our lives. So it's to say, like, those forces of death, that violence, that state of war in which we are living, and Rita Laura Segato speaks about war against women, right? As a permanent thing of our culture, is precisely saying that that's not the whole story about power. There's a deeper power in all of us that we can draw into and nurture ourselves from that deeper power to precisely invert the categories and question those systems that oppress us. So also something that I've heard amongst many survivors is, I hope you don't need to be brave. I'm tired of being brave and being strong. I just hope I didn't have to use my resistance, you know? And that's also a form of protest, precisely, of saying, this is maybe a strength or something that I wish I never had to use, because this shouldn't have happened in the first place. Okay, so what else? So, yeah. Okay, so about the different, like, racial categories, trans women, of course, there's other hierarchies within survivors that are not only gender categories. And in that sense, we're not created equal. In that sense, we don't have the same tools. In that sense, we don't have the same access to, from things like being able to pay a lawyer or being able to go to therapy, to having collective repertoires, to being believed. If you're, and there's one case in Chile of a survivor who is a trans woman, and in her case, the suspicion is even greater, right? Like, this person is already outside all the things that we consider normative. So if this person is claiming that he was raped by a priest when he was a young kid, like, who will believe, you know, or who will believe her? So, so I guess, like, if you introduce, like, race, if you introduce heteronormativity, like, the layers of shame, the layers of credibility, the layers of being able to articulate what happened to you, being believed, being able to build yourself up after that, they're different. They're just different. And of course, I didn't have time to go through those differences, but it's something that certainly we need to pay attention to. And finally, to Nancy's comment about being frozen and about anger, I think that's why maybe I didn't name those two things, and I think they're very important to be named. But that's, I think, why I was including this second category of a post-traumatic spirituality, because we need to, like, not rush too quickly into healing, into resilience, into hope, into living again, but really gave space for, I just mentioned two elements, shame and memory, and like the interruption of memory that walks with you. But again, being frozen, being angry, these are all also things that are really, really, really important. And I'm always, like, one of the arguments that I like to make is that when we talk, for example, about healing, reconciliation, most of that discourse is concerned with vengeance as the opposite of reconciliation or forgiving, right? And in the case of many survivors, you don't even have the energy for vengeance. Like, you're depressed, you cannot get out of your bed, and that's the main thing that you have to deal with first, without even, like, thinking about having the strength of doing the same thing that they did to you. Like, that's not even an option. So I guess, like, that's why that second of the three things, that second part is, like, we need to hold space for all of that, things that maybe we can like frame under like negativity, that really shape the experience of survivors, and that you cannot just like gloss over them if you're going to think about spirituality. Yeah.
Thank you, Sole. Thank you, everyone, for the questions. I think this is a never-ending discussion. We all go home with a lot of new ideas and questions to digest. So thank you very much for this very rich conversation. And now, Carlos.
Yes. Well, of course, this is an ongoing conversation, and I appreciate very much your presence here. Yes, Martin? Oh, sorry.
Are we late for something?
Yes, we are. But
okay.
we can
talk. We can talk when we eat. But I'm
yeah,
fine.
well, yeah. There is a social. This is a social, so we can just continue the conversation if you don't mind.
No, go.
If you want, come here.
No, go. We eat.
Okay. Yeah. Also, thank you so much for particularly Professor Maldonado-Torres, because I know you are a very busy scholar, and also all the time you receive a lot of invitations to be part of different conversations. But here at Boston College, we are really interested in improving this kind of collaborative way of thinking. And as you can see, a lot of scholars in different Department of Theology, School of Theology and Ministry, School of Law, even some of you are coming here, and some other students. I'm from Fordham University. Thank you, Professor Burnett. We are trying to continue this project in different seminars and colloquia. So you will be receiving some news. The next activity will be the next event in February, welcoming James Allison and talking about mimetic theory to approach the question of politics, how to build the common following this intuition of mimetic sacrifice and theory. So thank you so much. Also the students who will be who were moderators, particularly Martin also, and Francis. He has been working hard. He's preparing the social, so we can yeah, just crossing the street, getting out, and then to the left, crossing the street is a beautiful house. It's Robert's house. It's a Jesuit house, and we will be there for 1 hour. For a social. So thank you so much. You will be receiving some news. Thank you. Bye.